There is one moment in the Nolan Wells case that is becoming harder to ignore. It is not the moment when Nolan disappeared. It is not even the moment 2 days later when his body was found near Horn Island. It is a distress call. A call made from the boat that had taken Nolan and his friends to the island on July 4th. At first, the recording sounded like a simple request for help. The boat was taking on water. The bilge pump had stopped working. The caller asked for assistance. But there was something about that call that left people asking a very uncomfortable question. What exactly was happening on that boat when the call was made? And more importantly, what was happening before and after those words were spoken? The Wells family has now hired audio experts to examine the recording. Investigators are also analyzing the call themselves, according to officials. And that means a recording that might once have been treated as a minor part of the story is now being examined for clues about Nolan's final hours. To understand why that matters, we have to go back to the beginning. Before we go any further, if you've been following the Nolan Wells case and you appreciate having these developments explained carefully, rather than getting lost in every rumor online, consider subscribing to the channel. We follow the evidence, the timeline, and the questions that still don't have clear answers. And with this case continuing to develop, there is still a lot more to examine. Nolan Xavier Wells was 18 years old. He was from Ocean Springs, Mississippi, and was a college student and athlete with plans to return to football camp. On July 4, 2026, Nolan went with 3 friends by boat toward Horn Island, a barrier island off Mississippi's Gulf Coast. It was supposed to be a holiday outing. There were hundreds of people gathered around the island that day, enjoying the water and the 4th of July. For Nolan, it should have been one more summer memory before returning to school. Instead, it became the last day anyone can say with certainty that they saw him alive. The boat reportedly left a private dock at about 9:56 that morning. GPS information obtained by CBS News later showed the vessel arriving at Horn Island at approximately 11:14 a.m. For several hours, there was nothing unusual about the trip. Then came the decision to leave. According to the accounts given to authorities, Nolan did not return to the boat with the others. That single detail has become one of the central questions in this entire investigation. Authorities initially said they understood that Nolan had chosen to remain on the island, apparently expecting another ride back. But Nolan's parents have strongly disputed that explanation. His father, Elmore Wansley, said Nolan was someone who stayed with his group. His parents have repeatedly questioned why their son would willingly remain behind on a remote island while his friends returned by boat. And then there is the timeline. The boat reportedly left Horn Island around 4:31 p.m., but at about 4 p.m., a distress call was placed. That call came from the boat. The caller reported that the bilge pump had stopped working. He said the boat was taking on water. He asked for help. The recording reportedly includes the caller saying, "We're going. We're sinking. Can you please come?" And when the dispatcher asked whether everyone was on board and okay, the caller answered that everyone was on board. That detail has drawn attention because, according to the accounts investigators had received, Nolan was supposedly no longer on the boat at that point. Now, that does not automatically mean the caller was talking about Nolan. It does not prove that Nolan was on the boat, and it does not prove that anyone lied. Those are important distinctions. The investigation is still ongoing, and authorities have not publicly established that the distress call contains evidence of foul play. But the timing is difficult to overlook. A teenager had reportedly been left behind on an isolated island. His friends were traveling away from that island. Then, around the same period, the boat was calling for help because it was supposedly sinking. That is the point where the story becomes much more complicated. The call was made to Sea Tow, a private marine towing company. According to the released recording, the caller said there were about 7 people aboard and that everyone was unhurt. The towing company began dealing with the request, but the assistance was eventually canceled. A captain was told that the people aboard had solved the problem and no longer needed help. The boat later returned toward the mainland. GPS records place it in Fort Bayou around 5:52 p.m. and back at the dock around 6:06 p.m. By that evening, Nolan was still missing, and the clock was ticking. At approximately 11 p.m., the U.S. Coast Guard was notified about a missing person near Horn Island. One of the young men who had traveled with Nolan was reportedly the first person to make that report. Nolan's mother also reported him missing. A search followed. 2 days later, on July 6th, Nolan's body was found in the water near Horn Island. The holiday weekend had ended, but the questions were only beginning. Initially, authorities considered drowning as a possible explanation. There was no public confirmation of foul play, but Nolan's family did not believe the circumstances had been adequately explained, and as more information came out, several details began attracting attention. Nolan's phone was reportedly returned without him. Some messages and Snapchat data were reportedly missing. His keys were also found at another friend's home. The family questioned why Nolan would have been separated from belongings he normally would have needed to get home. There were also disagreements over what Nolan intended to do that afternoon. Some accounts suggested he had chosen to stay behind. His family questioned that version of events. And then came the autopsy. The family's independent autopsy, released in July, did not provide the simple answer everyone was hoping for. Instead, independent pathologist Dr. Roger Mitchell Jr. concluded that the cause and manner of Nolan's death were undetermined, pending further investigation. The examination was complicated by decomposition and by limitations involving the earlier examination of the body. No fractures or deep tissue injuries were identified, but a red discoloration on the back of Nolan's skull was noted and required further investigation. The independent pathologist said he could not rule out foul play. Meanwhile, the official state autopsy has been completed, but its findings have not been publicly released. Authorities have indicated that the results and other evidence are being handled as part of the continuing investigation, with material potentially going before a grand jury. And now we come back to that recording, because the audio experts hired by Nolan's family are not simply listening to it as an ordinary recording. They are examining it for details that might not be obvious during a casual listen. That can include identifying individual voices, separating overlapping sounds, clarifying words that are difficult to hear, and determining whether background sounds can help establish what was happening around the time of the call. But there is a major difference between finding a sound and proving what that sound means. That distinction matters here. Online, people have already begun discussing alleged phrases that they believe can be heard in enhanced versions of the recording. Some reports have mentioned phrases interpreted by listeners as questions such as, "Is he dead?" or commands such as, "Wake up." Those interpretations have generated enormous speculation, but they should not be treated as established facts. The publicly released material has not established that Nolan was alive on the boat, nor has it established that the voices were referring to him. That is exactly why the professional audio analysis matters. The question is not simply, what do people think they hear? The question is, what can trained analysis actually establish? And that could be a very different answer. Because if an audio expert can clearly identify words that were previously difficult to understand, the recording could provide investigators with another piece of the timeline. It might clarify who was speaking. It might clarify what the people aboard the boat believed was happening. It might establish whether certain words were actually spoken at all, or, just as importantly, the analysis might show that some of the dramatic interpretations circulating online are wrong. Either outcome would be significant. For Nolan's family, though, there is a much more personal reason this recording matters. They are not simply trying to solve an internet mystery. They are trying to understand what happened to their son. Nolan left home on July 4th, expecting to spend the holiday with friends. His parents expected him to come back. Instead, they received the news that he was missing. Then they learned that his body had been found, and weeks later, they were still waiting for a clear explanation of how their son died. The family's attorney, Ben Crump, has said the family wants outside authorities involved and has announced plans for experts to examine the distress call and other evidence. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People has now joined the legal effort seeking a thorough investigation, while members of Congress have also called for federal scrutiny. That does not mean a federal investigation has determined what happened. It means the pressure for answers has grown. And the distress call is now part of that larger search. There is something haunting about the timing. A young man was supposedly left behind on an island. A boat carrying his friends began having trouble. Someone called for help. The people on the boat said they were okay. The assistance was canceled. The boat returned. Nolan did not. 2 days later, he was found dead. And today, the recording from those crucial minutes is being examined more closely than before. So when people ask, "Is he alive?" that question needs to be handled carefully. Nolan was tragically found dead on July 6. There is no credible evidence establishing that he survived beyond that discovery. The real question raised by the distress call is different. Was there something happening during those final hours that investigators have not yet fully explained? And if the enhanced audio reveals something important, could it help establish what happened between the moment Nolan was last seen and the moment his body was found? For now, those answers remain unresolved, but the recording has moved from the background of the case to the center of attention. And that is where the story takes an even more complicated turn. Because once investigators began looking closely at the timeline, another issue emerged. The difference between what the boat's occupants reportedly said happened, what the GPS data shows, and what Nolan's family says their son would have done. Those three pieces do not automatically fit together, and the next question is whether the audio can help close that gap. Before we move into the next part, I want to hear from you. After everything we've covered so far, what stands out to you most about that distress call? Is it the timing, the statement that everyone was supposedly on board, or the fact that Nolan was reportedly no longer with the group? Let me know in the comments, but keep it respectful. We're dealing with a real family, real people, and a case where many important questions are still unanswered. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is a good time to join us, because we're going to take a much closer look at what happened next. By the time the debate over the enhanced audio reached its peak, something interesting had begun to happen. People were no longer asking only what they could hear. They were asking whether they had been focusing on the wrong piece of the investigation all along. At first, that seemed like a surprising shift. After all, the distress call had become one of the most talked-about pieces of evidence connected to Nolan Wells. Every time a new cleaned-up version appeared online, people rushed to compare it with the last one. Some were convinced a hidden phrase had finally been uncovered. Others believed the newest version sounded almost identical to earlier uploads. And the more versions appeared, the more divided people became. That raises a simple question. If 5 different people produce 5 different enhanced recordings, which one should the public trust? The honest answer is that, based on the information available, there is no indication that investigators have endorsed the widely circulated internet versions as official evidence. That does not necessarily mean those recordings are useless. It means viewers have to be careful about the difference between an audio file being processed and an investigative conclusion being reached. That distinction is easy to lose when a dramatic headline promises that something hidden has finally been revealed. But investigators do not have the luxury of deciding what is true based on how convincing a recording sounds. They have to establish where the recording came from, how it was handled, what was changed during processing, and whether the result can be independently verified. That brings us back to the original recording. Because before anyone can decide what an enhanced version means, there has to be an original version to compare it with. Think about an old family cassette tape. Maybe it was recorded decades ago. The voices are faint. There is background noise. Perhaps someone was talking while a television was playing in another room. You might take that recording today and use modern software to make the voices easier to hear. Sometimes that works beautifully, but there is a limit. If the original recording never captured a particular word clearly, software cannot simply reach back in time and retrieve information that was never recorded. It can improve what is there. It cannot guarantee that something new has been recovered. And that is where artificial intelligence creates another layer of difficulty. Today, almost anyone can take a poor quality recording and run it through an AI-powered application. The technology can reduce background noise, separate certain frequencies, increase clarity, and make portions of a recording easier for ordinary listeners to understand. That can be incredibly useful. But some systems also make predictions about unclear speech. And a prediction is not the same thing as preserved evidence. That difference matters enormously in a case where a single word could influence how people understand an entire timeline. Imagine standing outside during a heavy rainstorm. Someone across the street calls your name. You hear something, but you're not sure what it was. Now imagine someone takes a recording of that moment and removes some of the rain, raises the volume, and emphasizes certain frequencies. You might hear the person more clearly. But there is another possibility. Your brain may begin filling in the gaps. If somebody tells you beforehand that the person said your name, you may suddenly hear your name too. That does not mean you are being dishonest. It is simply how human perception works. And that is one reason forensic audio analysis has to be handled carefully. Experts generally compare processed audio against the untouched original. They preserve the different stages of enhancement. They document what was done, and they try to determine whether a sound exists in the original recording or appeared because of processing. That is very different from simply uploading an audio file, applying a filter, and announcing that a hidden conversation has been discovered. And in Nolan's case, that distinction is especially important because of how quickly the recording spread online. Copies were uploaded, videos were edited, audio was processed again. Some versions were shared without clearly identifying where the file originated. Eventually, it became difficult for ordinary viewers to know which version they were listening to or what had been done to it before they heard it. That creates another important issue. Chain of custody. In an investigation, evidence needs a reliable history. Investigators want to know where an item came from, who handled it, whether it was altered, and how it was preserved. That principle applies to physical evidence. It applies to digital evidence. And it applies to recordings. If a digital file has been downloaded, edited, re-exported, uploaded, downloaded again, and processed by another person, the question becomes much more complicated. What exactly are we hearing, and how close is it to the original? Those questions do not prove that an online recording is false. They simply explain why investigators cannot treat every version circulating on social media as though it carries the same evidentiary weight. There is another detail that often gets overlooked. When most people listen to a recording, they naturally concentrate on the voices. Investigators can also pay attention to everything happening around those voices. A passing vehicle, running water, wind, birds, construction equipment, a door closing, a mechanical sound from the boat. Those background sounds can sometimes provide useful context about location, timing, or distance, even when the spoken words remain difficult to understand. That is why forensic audio analysis can be much more complicated than simply turning up the volume. The question is not only, can we hear the voice? It can also be, what else was happening at the same time? And that brings us back to the distress call itself. According to the publicly discussed account, the caller reported a problem with the boat. The bilge pump was reportedly not working. The boat was said to be taking on water. Help was requested. Then the assistance was canceled after the people aboard reportedly said the problem had been resolved. For many viewers, that sequence raises an obvious question. If everyone aboard was reportedly safe, why was the call made in the first place? And if Nolan was supposedly no longer with the group, why did the caller reportedly say everyone was on board? Those are reasonable questions. But they are still questions. They are not proof of what happened. That distinction is important because investigations can contain apparent contradictions that have completely ordinary explanations. A person may misunderstand a question. Someone may speak imprecisely. A witness may remember an event differently weeks later. A stressful situation can affect memory, and people on a boat dealing with mechanical problems may not communicate in perfectly precise language. Investigators therefore have to compare the statements with other evidence. Does the timeline match the phone records? Does the GPS information match the reported movements? Do witness accounts agree with one another? Does the physical evidence support the sequence people described? Those are the questions that matter. One contradiction by itself rarely solves an investigation. Several independent pieces of evidence pointing toward the same conclusion can be much more significant. That is why the focus of the Nolan Wells investigation cannot rest entirely on one recording. The audio may be important. The autopsy may be important. The digital evidence may be important. The witness accounts may be important. But each one has to be examined alongside the others. And that is where the public conversation becomes much more complicated than the videos and headlines suggest. Because online, the case can sometimes appear to move from one theory to another every few hours. One day the attention is on the phone. The next day it is on the distress call. Then someone releases another enhanced version. Suddenly that becomes the focus. Then attention shifts back to the autopsy. But an investigation does not necessarily move at the same speed. Detectives may spend days reviewing something that takes only seconds to explain publicly. They may revisit a timeline repeatedly. They may re-interview people. They may compare digital records. They may examine evidence that the public has never seen. And sometimes the most important work is the work nobody notices. That can be frustrating for a family waiting for answers. It can also be frustrating for everyone watching from home. We want the moment when someone finally says, "Now we know." But difficult investigations rarely work that way. More often, the picture becomes clearer, one piece at a time. A phone record confirms one part of a timeline. A witness statement supports another. A digital record contradicts something that was previously believed. A forensic examination explains a physical detail. And slowly, those pieces begin to form a picture. That is why it is dangerous to let one dramatic audio clip become the entire case. The recording may eventually prove important. It may also turn out to be less significant than people currently believe. At this point, the publicly available information does not allow us to say with certainty which of those possibilities is correct. And there is another question that deserves attention. Who actually created the enhanced version that received the most attention online? That answer became surprisingly difficult to establish. Copies spread quickly across social media. Some were downloaded, some were edited, some were uploaded again. Others were incorporated into longer videos. After enough sharing, tracing a file back to its original source became increasingly difficult. That matters because an investigator needs to know not only what a recording sounds like, but where it came from. Without that history, it becomes harder to establish authenticity. And this is not a problem unique to Nolan Wells's case. Modern investigations are increasingly dealing with edited photographs, manipulated videos, AI-generated material, altered text messages, and processed audio. Technology has made information easier to create and share. It has also made verification more important. And perhaps that is the biggest lesson from the controversy surrounding Nolan's distress call. The fact that technology can make something sound clearer does not automatically mean it makes the underlying evidence more certain. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it doesn't. The only way to know is through careful analysis. That is why the work of professional audio experts could become so important. If their analysis can establish that certain words are genuinely present in the original recording, that would be meaningful. If they determine that certain sounds are artifacts created by processing, that would also be meaningful. Either way, the goal should be the same. Not to prove a theory, to establish what the evidence can actually support. And there is one more shift that has happened as people have looked more closely at the case. The conversation has slowly moved away from the recording itself and back toward Nolan's final known movements. People are comparing timelines. They are reviewing publicly discussed witness accounts. They are looking at digital activity. They are asking whether the different pieces fit together. And when they don't seem to fit neatly, another question naturally follows. Why? But again, a discrepancy does not automatically mean deception. Two people can witness the same event and remember it differently. Someone standing in bright sunlight may remember something differently from someone standing farther away. A person under stress may misremember the order of events, and as time passes, memories can become less precise. That is why investigators look for patterns. One inconsistency may have a simple explanation. Several independent inconsistencies may deserve much closer attention. The important thing is to establish which is which. And that brings us to the question I want you to think about before we move into the final part. After hearing all of this, do you think the distress call deserves to be treated as one of the most important pieces of evidence in the Nolan Wells case, or do you think the broader timeline and other evidence deserve much more attention? There may not be a simple answer, but that is exactly why your perspective matters. Leave your thoughts in the comments and keep the conversation respectful. We're talking about a real family and a young man whose death has left people searching for answers. And if you've been following this investigation with us, make sure you're subscribed, because the final part brings the focus back to the broader investigation, the questions that still remain unanswered publicly, and what investigators may ultimately need to establish before any theory can be accepted as fact. As we come to the final part of this story, there is one thing worth remembering. The Nolan Wells case has generated enormous public attention, but attention is not the same thing as certainty. The enhanced distress call has been replayed. The autopsy has been discussed. Timelines have been compared. Witness accounts have been examined. And every new piece of information has brought another round of questions. But despite all of that, the central mystery remains. What happened during Nolan's final known hours? That is the question investigators still have to answer. And it is important to begin this final part by separating one thing from another. Nolan Wells was found dead on July 6th. There is no credible evidence establishing that he survived beyond that discovery. So when people ask, is he alive? The question cannot honestly be answered, as though Nolan's whereabouts are still unknown. He was found. The uncertainty concerns what happened before his death. And that distinction matters, because the distress call may contain information about those final hours, but the recording has not publicly established the circumstances of Nolan's death by itself. The same is true of the autopsy. It can provide medical information. It can identify injuries or physical findings. It can help investigators understand what happened to a person's body, but it does not automatically reconstruct every moment leading up to a death. That requires the rest of the investigation. And this is where the different pieces of Nolan's case have to come together. The timeline, the boat's movements, the distress call, the statements from the people who were there, Nolan's digital activity, the search, the medical findings, and any additional evidence investigators may have collected but have not released publicly. Each piece answers a different question. The distress call asks what was happening on the boat. The GPS information can help establish where the boat was. Phone and digital records may help establish when people communicated or moved. Witness statements can provide context. Medical evidence can help explain what happened to Nolan physically. The challenge is determining whether all of those pieces tell the same story. That is where this case remains unsettled. According to the publicly discussed timeline, Nolan went to Horn Island with friends on July 4th. He was later reportedly separated from the group. The boat left. A distress call was made. The people aboard reportedly said they were safe. The assistance was canceled. The boat returned to the mainland. Nolan remained missing, and 2 days later, his body was found. Every one of those events can be described individually. The difficult part is explaining how they connect. That is what investigators have to establish. And it is also why the enhanced audio has attracted so much attention. If the recording can reliably clarify what was being said during those crucial minutes, it could potentially help investigators understand the circumstances surrounding the boat's movements. But there is a limit. Even a perfectly authenticated recording cannot necessarily answer every question. It cannot tell investigators everything that happened before the call. It cannot automatically explain what happened after the boat returned. And it cannot replace physical evidence. That is why the most responsible way to view the audio is as one potential piece of the puzzle, not the entire puzzle. There is also the question of the different versions circulating online. Some people hear one phrase, others hear another. Some believe the recording contains a reference to Nolan. Others hear nothing unusual, and that disagreement itself is revealing. It shows how easily people can become attached to a particular interpretation when they desperately want an answer. That does not make those people careless. It makes them human. Nolan was 18 years old. He had parents waiting for him. He had friends. He had plans. And then suddenly, those plans were gone. Anyone who has ever loved a child understands why a family would listen to a recording again and again, searching for anything that might explain what happened. But investigators have a different responsibility. They cannot simply accept the interpretation that feels most convincing. They have to ask whether it can be proven. That may take time, and sometimes it means refusing to make a conclusion until more evidence becomes available. For a family, that waiting can be incredibly difficult, especially when the internet is producing a new theory every day. One video says the recording proves something. Another says it disproves it. A third claims to have discovered a phrase no one noticed before. Then another version appears and sounds completely different. The result can leave people more confused than when they started. That is why authentication matters so much. If investigators eventually release a verified analysis of the distress call, that could help settle at least some of the debate. Until then, Viewers should be cautious about treating any particular internet enhancement as definitive. The same caution applies to the autopsy. The independent examination raised questions and left the cause and manner of death undetermined pending further investigation. That is significant. But it is not the same as a finding that foul play definitely occurred, and it is not proof that someone aboard the boat caused Nolan's death. Those conclusions require evidence. That distinction may disappoint people who want a clear answer right now. But an investigation has to follow the evidence wherever it leads. If the evidence ultimately points to an accident, investigators need to be able to establish that. If it points somewhere else, they need to establish that too. The goal is not to confirm what people already believe. The goal is to determine what actually happened. And there is another reason investigators may be careful about what they release publicly. If a case is being reviewed for possible criminal prosecution, releasing every detail can create problems. Witnesses may unconsciously change their recollections after hearing information publicly. Potential suspects can learn what investigators know. Evidence can become harder to evaluate independently. And information that has not yet been verified can spread far beyond its original context. That is one reason investigators sometimes keep important evidence private. Silence does not necessarily mean nothing is happening. Sometimes it means investigators are still working. And that may be particularly relevant here because publicly discussed information indicates that authorities are continuing to examine multiple categories of evidence rather than relying on the distress call alone. The broader investigation matters. The timeline matters. The digital records matter. The physical evidence matters. The medical findings matter. And the testimony of the people who were there matters. Eventually, those pieces have to be compared. That is when contradictions can become meaningful. If one person's account places an event at a particular time, but digital records place it somewhere else, investigators have to explain the difference. If a witness remembers something happening before the distress call, but another piece of evidence suggests otherwise, that discrepancy needs to be examined. If the boat's documented movements do not fit the reported timeline, investigators have to understand why. None of these things automatically proves wrongdoing, but they can help investigators determine where to look next. And that is why the timeline may ultimately prove more important than any single phrase in the recording. A single word can be misunderstood. A timeline built from several independent sources is much harder to dismiss. That is the kind of evidence that can eventually turn uncertainty into something much more concrete. And perhaps that is the most important lesson from the Nolan Wells case. We live in an age when evidence can be manipulated, enhanced, clipped, slowed down, enlarged, filtered, and shared within minutes. A photograph can be altered. A video can be edited. A voice can be synthesized. An audio recording can be processed until it sounds completely different from the original. That technology can be useful, but it also places a greater responsibility on viewers. We have to ask where something came from, who processed it, what was changed, what remains in the original, and has an independent expert confirmed the interpretation. Those questions may not produce the most dramatic video thumbnail, but they are the questions that protect people from being misled. And in a case involving a young man who died under circumstances that remain publicly disputed, that matters. There is also something else worth remembering. Nolan's family does not have the luxury of treating this as an online mystery. For many people watching, the case becomes part of the day's news. A video appears. People discuss it. Another update comes along. Then attention moves somewhere else. For Nolan's parents, there is no moving on in the same way. They are still living with the loss, still waiting for answers, still asking whether everything that could have been examined has been examined. That is why the call for a thorough investigation matters, beyond social media arguments. The purpose should not be to satisfy an audience. It should be to provide a family with answers supported by evidence. And if the investigation eventually determines that the distress call contains information that changes the understanding of Nolan's final hours, that information should be examined carefully. If it does not, that should also be acknowledged. Sometimes the most important conclusion is discovering that a popular theory cannot be supported. That may not feel satisfying, but it is still progress. Because eliminating an unsupported theory allows investigators to focus their attention elsewhere. And that brings us back to the question that has followed this case from the beginning. What happened to Nolan Wells? Right now, Publicly available information does not provide a complete answer. The enhanced audio has raised questions. The autopsy has raised questions. The timeline has raised questions. But questions are not conclusions. And that is the line we have to maintain. There may be additional evidence that the public has not seen. There may be future forensic findings. There may be additional witness interviews. There may be information from digital records that investigators have not yet released. Until those details become available and are independently verified, some parts of Nolan's final hours will remain uncertain. That uncertainty is difficult, but it is better than pretending to know something the evidence has not established. Before we close, I want to ask you one final question. After everything we've examined today, do you believe the enhanced audio has helped the public better understand Nolan Wells' case, or do you think the broader investigation deserves much more attention than the recording itself? Tell me what you think in the comments, and if you're comfortable, tell us where you're watching from. One of the remarkable things about following a case like this is seeing how many people, from different cities and different countries, continue to care about a family they may never have met. That kind of attention can be meaningful when it is grounded in compassion and facts. So if you've been here from the beginning, thank you. If you joined us today because of the distress call, thank you for taking the time to listen. And if this is your first time here, I hope you'll consider joining this community. If you believe families deserve careful reporting instead of sensational headlines, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We will continue following the Nolan Wells investigation as verified developments become available. Not every update will provide the answer everyone is hoping for, but when new information does emerge, we'll slow it down, examine it carefully, and separate what is confirmed from what is still speculation. Because ultimately, Nolan's story should not be reduced to an audio clip, a headline, or a theory circulating online. He was a young man with a family who loved him, and whatever the final answers may be, those answers deserve to be built on evidence. Thank you for spending part of your day with me. And thank you for keeping the conversation thoughtful and respectful. We'll continue watching this case closely. Until next time, take care of yourselves, take care of one another, and remember that when the truth is difficult to find, patience and careful attention to the evidence matter more than ever.